All right, we're moving into one of my favorite topics in this class, policy failure and learning. I love learning from failure. And I think that these two sets of slides on policy failure and learning are probably my favorite. And it's one of my favorite discussions to have with students because we really begin to think about why do we have such bad policies? Why don't they work? And then what can we do about it, right? How can we improve? And I think a lot of you in your papers that you're working on for this class, you're kind of approaching this idea of, hey, this kind of policy is not great. It seems to be failing. Now, why can't we learn from it and change, right? And that's kind of what we're kind of really getting into with this notion of understanding policy failure. So, review of implementation. In the last set of slides, implementation is complex. Policies don't just self-execute. They don't just get signed into law and automatically happen, right? Policy design to improve implementation, right? Trying to design policies that make implementation successful is very challenging. And notably, bureaucrats have a lot of discretion, right? There's that level of administrative discretion. This all sets the stage for understanding why policies can fail. So, is implementation technical or political? The old idea is that administration simply does the will of the legislature, right? The kind of early politics administration dichotomy, if you discuss this with in a class, maybe on public administration, this is the kind of the expression of the will through the public and through the political process, and the execution of the will through the administrative process. And these two things are fully separate, and there should be no level of administrative discretion, right? They should just follow what the political will is. The new idea is that administration is this kind of political process, that implementation is inherently political, that it does have this level of discretion, and that discretion is based on values, it's based on biases, it's based on how we want to allocate the benefits of a policy as it's being implemented on the ground. So think about who is responsible for implementation. All of these components, right? They all have a say in this kind of level of, is policy successful, right? There is a shared responsibility among the legislature, among the executive and the bureaucracy, in the courts, the public, right? The policy targets. Everybody has to work well together for implementation to occur. So these kind of four studies that we just went over, the kind of the classic period, the modern generation of implementation. So why policies might fail? This is essential for improvement. Sometimes it's related to behavioral issues and goal issues. People that may respond to adaptive policies in ways that negate their influence, right? So perhaps there's a policy put out there, and as soon as the public is responding to that implementation, the way that they were responding to it completely negates the actual goal of the policy. Sometimes policies have incompatible goals with other policies, right? So you have a policy out there, and then you have other policies put in place, and they're in conflict with one another. Think about economic development and stay-at-home orders during the pandemic, or education and learning from Zoom during the pandemic, right? These things have incompatible goals, but there are two policies in play at the same time. And sometimes the public just does not want to accept the consequences or the costs of the policy. Think about the mask mandate, that a lot of people just refuse to go with it because of the cost of whether it's uncomfortable or whatever it may be, right? The cost of being comfortable outweighed for a lot of those folks who kind of refused, and even the states that didn't comply with kind of public health. So the second reason is related to resources and implementation, right? Inadequate resources are allocated for implementation. Maybe the policies were watered down during implementation, right? So there was a really strict penalty, and by the time it's actually being implemented, it's more watered down. The penalty isn't as strict. Think about, initially a fine set at $1 million. All of a sudden, when it's actually being implemented, that fine is $1,000. People aren't going to care. You saw in the video on on the federal highway law for 55 miles per hour speed limit. The folks were just going 70 on that stretch of freeway in the video, and they were just paying the fine and taking the ticket. It was worth risking having to pay a small fine than having to drive so slow. And then we think that that causal design is important here, right? So maybe all of the different links in the causal chain weren't thought about, and there are actually multiple causal problems or multiple causes that lead to the problem, and the solution only tackles one. Kind of a third set of reasons is around complexity and context. So many problems cannot be solved completely, right? They are really complicated. We have a lot of problems out there, and actual resolution to them is near impossible. Think about some really, really intractable issues. Homelessness is certainly one, right? It has multiple causes. It's very complex. And it's one of these things that is just very difficult to solve. New problems come up and distract us from the current focus that we have, right? So we talked about how attention spans are really short. And so if we have enough attention to focus on getting one policy passed and we're implementing it, and then all of a sudden, boom, a new policy or a new problem shows up, and our attention focus is moving over to that, then that is going to distract us from the current focus on this policy, right? It may not distract that lowest level implementer, the person being paid to carry it out, but it's going to distract the executive and the other political masters who champion and support the policy, right? Because now their attention is focused elsewhere. And so we talked about how that kind of executive support is so key. And we learned that from that first generation of policy studies in the 70s. But once their focus moves elsewhere, then that can lead to a problem here. And then the third kind of component around this is the intergovernmental relations and federalism aspect, right? State and local coordination with the federal government can be very difficult and challenging. You face jurisdictional issues. You face challenges from states that may be oriented politically different than those in power at the federal level. So think about a Democrat in the White House or Congress that creates a policy and mandates that all the states implement it, and you have red states that don't want to implement it because it's a policy that they fundamentally disagree with. And so that's going to lead to a coordination challenge. Sometimes we have like the Real ID, right? That you have to fly on airplanes if you're using a driver's license instead of a passport. That law went into effect after 9/11, and it is finally, they've set a deadline for just this past month in May to actually enforce it, right? So that's like 25 years to get us to enforcement, and that is mainly because of state capacity. The states had an unfunded mandate to come up with these brand new IDs and ways to distribute them to the public, but there were no dollars from the federal government behind this. So responses to policy failure. The government may change its enforcement methods. It may allocate more money or resources. There may be some legal challenges or constitutional challenges to it. The government could just ignore it. Or the government could push it down to another level of government. And finally, the government could abandon or repeal the policy if it's a complete failure. Here's where the rubber hits the road, kind of like implementation with the concepts around policy failure. And here's why I think it's kind of fun. It's a slippery concept, right? A sticky concept is something you can grasp onto, right? A concept that you can say, I can define this really easily. A slippery concept is one that's hard to define. And that's because success and failure can be subjective, right? The Affordable Care Act, when that rolled out during the Obama administration for this kind of healthcare for all, it was a huge success for Democrats. They were thrilled with it. It was a failure for Republicans. They did not want this, right? So it was subjective, right? When the websites didn't work, when they rolled out the Affordable Care Act for people to actually enroll in this thing, and they put it on this website, and it failed like Ticketmaster when Benson Boone or Taylor Swift puts on a concert, right? And it doesn't work. that was a failure for the Democrats and a success for the Republicans, right? So we can have this kind of notion of the policy winners and losers are going to perceive success and failure differently. Different stakeholders have different criteria about what is success and what is failure. The Clean Water Act of 1974 had a very clear goal, right? That all lakes and rivers would be fishable and swimmable by 1985. Think about that. 10 years, all lakes in America fishable and swimmable. It didn't happen, right? But water quality did improve, and there has been incremental improvement ever since. And so, is that a success? Right? It didn't achieve this goal 100%, but there is this kind of incremental level of improvement. And so maybe that's success, right? So, or maybe it's failure, right? So how do we kind of perceive what that may be? To me, there aren't rivers on fire anymore like there were in the 1970s, and pollution is down in our rivers and it's not as bad. And so I think that's a policy success. There's definitely more work to do in areas like that, but incremental steps, and I'm an incrementalist. Incremental steps are improvement to me. Timing matters for assessment. So when do you determine if it's a success or a failure? It kind of goes with what I just said with incrementalism, but also this notion of when do you measure success? Can you measure it immediately, or are we measuring long-term goals, right? I could measure your success in this class at the end of the term when I grade your paper, right? And say, oh, they know public policy. Congratulations. Or I could measure your success when you finish college, right? And you have a job that is going to be worthwhile and engaging and reflect the education that you got at Cal State Fullerton. Or I can measure your success 5 years down the road from graduation, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, right? Where are you? What did this degree do? What did anything maybe you retained from the summer class or your semester class, right? Do for you in the long run. There's two types of failure: theoretical failure and programmatic failure. Theoretical failure is the causal theory didn't work as predicted. So you kind of didn't understand the cause-effect relationship. Programmatic failure is implementation didn't go as planned. So it's a good theory, but it was executed poorly. I'll give you an example that I often use for this one, and that's school uniforms, right? The modern school uniform that kind of really came about during the 80s and 90s, being widely used in a lot of different public and private schools, kind of stemmed in many areas from bullying and violence, or even potentially gang violence in urban areas within high schools and other schools, right? And so the causal theory was put everybody in the same clothes, and they won't be able to recognize which gang they may perhaps be in, or they won't be able to pick on somebody for not having the nicest clothes or the newest clothes or the fanciest brand or something like that. And so the theory is school uniforms on, incidents of violence down. So we would know that that is a success if, yes, everybody now you measure violence or bullying incidents, right, in the school, fights or whatever, prior to implementation, prior to making everybody put on uniforms. And if it goes down after the uniforms are on, and maybe you measure it at several different time periods, right, then you know this perhaps was a policy success, right? Your causal model worked. If it stays the same, then it didn't really have any impact. And if violence goes up, then you're obviously wrong, right? Your causal model is completely wrong, right? But this just pissed everybody off to put the uniforms on. The other factor would be programmatic failure. So the theory is good, right? Put the uniforms on the students, incidents of bullying or violence goes down, right? But now, as it's being implemented, perhaps the teachers, the street level bureaucrats, right, that lowest level implementer isn't really enforcing it, right? So maybe, I don't know what the uniforms are, but the color options are so varied that the people in different gangs pick colored options, and the faculty didn't recognize it, right? So the actual policy target, the students, are kind of altering implementation as it is underway, or the administrators aren't enforcing the dress code, the teachers aren't enforcing the dress code, and students are able to alter their uniforms or wear some different clothes somehow. Or even perhaps there's like the Walmart brand uniform versus the luxury store uniform, and the students now can tell the difference between the cheap version and the expensive version, and start bullying each other again. So this would be a programmatic failure, right? The theory is good, but the execution, either by the alteration from the policy target, the student, or the lowest level implementer, the teacher, the principal, or something like that, is not going as planned. So we talk about how failure is the slippery concept. It's because it's in the eye of the beholder, right? This kind of builds into it. And we ask, when did it fail? Who did it fail? Where did it fail? How did it fail? And each question, no matter who you ask, you may get a different response for it. So implementation is inherently political, not just technical. Policy failure has a lot of causes, and there's a lot of different types. Failure is subjective, right, and context dependent. And understanding failure patterns may help improve policy design. So thinking about it kind of from a theoretical perspective or a programmatic perspective can help us improve how we design our policies. So next time we'll move from failure to learning. See you then.